King Alfonso II, clad from head to toe in steel armor, his face as lifeless as carved stone, his eyes cold and sharp as the frost of midwinter. In his hands there was no sword, no weapon of war, only a single sheet of parchment, sealed with the royal crest, the ink upon it still damp. His own signature glistened at the bottom, the decree ordering the arrest of his only son, Prince Rodrigo. This was the same child whose first smile had sent the king into the streets of Madrid, scattering sweets among the people in celebration. The same son whose laughter had echoed through the hunting forests, whose unrestrained giggles once brought tears of joy to the king's eyes. But tonight, he was no father. Tonight, he was only a king. And kings, he told himself, have no hearts, or at least that was the lie he had no choice but to believe. The scent of rain clung to the palace's cold stone floors, seeping into the air like an unshakable memory. Outside, the storm rattled the windows, but inside, the royal corridors glowed dimly under the flicker of yellow torchlight. The flames trembled in their sconces, as if even they knew that tonight, darkness would hold dominion over light. King Alfonso II advanced down the hall, each step heavy and deliberate. His steel boots struck the floor with the sharp, ringing finality of hammers on stone, the sound echoing through the distant roll of thunder. Behind him, the royal guards followed in rigid formation, long iron chains draped in their gloved hands. Yet the set of their shoulders and the tightness in their jaws betrayed an unease they could not mask. These were men who had faced enemy blades without fear. And yet, tonight, the thought of arresting their own prince left them quietly afraid. At the threshold of the prince's chamber, Alfonso stopped. The guards glanced at one another, the air between them weighted with an unspoken truth. Once this door opened, there would be no way back. One among them, older than the rest, and with eyes lined by years of loyalty, stepped forward. He had known the prince since he was a laughing boy, chasing dogs through the gardens. His voice was low, almost uncertain. "Your Majesty, if you wish, the order could be carried out at dawn instead." Alfonso's gaze locked with the man's, a silent exchange of plea and command. For a moment, the king's eyes softened, the ghost of a father flickering there, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "By morning, the kingdom could change," he said, his tone level, almost detached. "It will be the night that decides." Even before the door opened, a faint ripple of laughter floated through the wood. Light, careless, and wrong in the stillness of the corridor. The heavy latch turned with a deep, metallic click. The hinges groaned. Slowly, the chamber came into view, revealed inch by inch like a dangerous truth no one truly wished to face. Prince Rodrigo stood at the very heart of the chamber, the picture of careless defiance. His royal robe hung crooked over his shoulders, worn backwards, as if in mockery of the dignity it once symbolized. In one hand, he cradled a goblet of wine, the deep red shimmering in the flicker of torchlight like liquid rubies. That same wavering light caught in his eyes, where mischief and exhaustion tangled in a way that only long nights and heavier burdens could create. "Father," he greeted with a faint, knowing smile, the words carrying both warmth and provocation. "For you to come at this hour means either you could not sleep, or you've come bearing bad news." King Alfonso's face remained carved from stone, betraying nothing. From the shadows behind him came the faint, deliberate rattle of chains, a sound far heavier than its weight. Rodrigo's gaze slid lazily toward the guards, and he lifted his goblet in a mock toast. "Chains? Are these meant as a gift? Or would you prefer I introduce a bold new fashion to the court? Before the king could answer, a voice cut through the thick air, soft, urgent, and edged with disbelief. From the corner of the room, Queen Elena emerged, her steps quick with alarm. In her hands, she carried a shawl, its fabric trembling with her grip. She reached toward her husband's shoulders, but her arms halted halfway, caught by the cold, unyielding presence of the chains between them. "Alfonso, this is wrong," she pleaded, her voice catching. "You may save the kingdom, but you will lose a husband, and you will lose a son." The king's eyes met hers for a single, heavy heartbeat. Words rose in him, perhaps an explanation, perhaps an apology, but they never escaped. Instead, he turned his gaze away, hiding them in the iron vault of a ruler's resolve. Rodrigo looked at his wife, his tone soft, but laced with bitter humor. "Elena, don't worry. Perhaps the rats in the dungeon will make good company." Then, turning back to his father, his voice sharpened into a blade of sarcasm. "At least they won't try to take the throne from me." At Alfonso's faintest nod, the guards advanced. The sound of their boots against the stone floor was slow, deliberate, the kind of march that made the air feel heavier with each step. Cold iron kissed Rodrigo's wrists first, then his ankles, biting down with a final metallic snap that echoed like a closing verdict. Outside, rain drummed against the tall windows, steady, unrelenting. Between each strike of water, there was only silence, and the muffled sobs of Queen Elena, clinging to the shadows. When one of the guards twisted the iron ring a little too tight, a sharp breath escaped Rodrigo's lips. For a heartbeat, pain flickered across his face, but just as quickly, it was gone, replaced with that infuriating smirk of his. "Careful," he murmured, voice rich with mockery. "Pull too hard, and by morning, the palace will be buzzing with tales that it took the entire royal guard to tie up the prince." Elena leaned in close, her trembling voice barely more than a breath. "Rodrigo, please, this is no time for jokes." He turned his head toward her, locking onto her eyes that carried both terror and love, as if both were fighting for space in the same tear. His voice softened to a private murmur. "That's exactly why I must joke. Because if I don't, I'll break." The guards began to pull him toward the doorway. In the corridor beyond, the torchlight rose and fell over his face. One moment gilded in gold, the next swallowed by shadow. Each step away from the room felt like a chapter closing. Alfonso followed, his armor whispering against itself with every movement. Then, as if some invisible thread tugged at him, he stopped. His eyes stayed on Rodrigo's back, as though looking long enough might keep him from vanishing into the dark. Rodrigo, sensing the weight behind him, lifted his head and turned just enough to meet his father's gaze. "Do you remember, Father? The day you told me I was the greatest achievement of your life?" Alfonso's eyes dropped, his voice stripped of all the king's iron and left only with the man's sorrow. "I remember, and that is why tonight is my greatest failure." The words lingered in the corridor, hanging in the air like smoke that refused to fade. Then came silence. Silence, save for the relentless percussion of rain drumming against the palace walls as if the heavens themselves bore witness to what had just been spoken. But nights like this never come without warning. Behind the rain, behind the cold, unyielding steel of this moment, lay 3 long years of history. A history that began in love, but slowly drowned in the tides of politics, betrayal, and unyielding pride, until there could be no ending but this. Spring had descended upon the royal gardens in all its glory. Roses, lilies, and narcissus stood in riotous bloom, their fragrances mingling in the air and slipping through the open windows of the palace. In the distance, the faint tolling of church bells drifted on the breeze, the evening prayer rising from the city's great cathedrals. Inside, the palace blazed with light. Golden chandeliers spilled their glow over carpets woven in deep reds and blues, their soft sheen reflecting off the polished marble. Along the walls, great canvases told stories of Spanish triumph. Soldiers locked in battle with the sea itself, storming stone fortresses, and raising the royal standard above conquered lands. This was no ordinary day. Crown Prince Rodrigo, now 23, was to sit beside King Alfonso II on the central throne of the royal court for the very first time, an honor not granted to every heir. Draped in regal blue velvet, Alfonso turned to his son. "Remember, my son," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the crown. "Today, they are not only looking at you, they are looking at the king to come." Rodrigo's lips curved into a faint smile, a trace of mischief glinting in his eyes. "Then I suppose," he replied lightly, "I'll have to appear a little more serious. Otherwise, they'll think the next king has far too much love for jokes." Queen Elena, Rodrigo's wife, smiled softly at his playful remark. She was a woman of gentle temperament, yet quick wit, and in the 2 years since their marriage, their bond had become one of the most cherished sights in the palace. The servants would often whisper with fond amusement, "Look at the prince and princess. It's as if spring itself has taken residence here." In the weeks that followed, the palace bloomed with joy. Rodrigo did not merely take his seat beside his father during the court's councils. He stepped into his role with energy and vision. He led military drills with the discipline of a soldier and the confidence of a man destined for command. Beyond the marble halls, his popularity among the people grew quickly. Often, he would venture into the city without the weight of royal ceremony, walking through bustling markets, exchanging warm words with merchants, placing silver coins into the hands of laughing children, and listening to the grievances of common folk as if they were old friends. Alfonso watched all this with a quiet pride, and yet, in the shadowed corners of his mind, unease lingered. Could this gentleness, he wondered, one day prove to be the crown's greatest weakness? It was the beginning of summer when a momentous announcement reached the court. To strengthen the alliance between Spain and Aragon, a marriage pact was being arranged. At the heart of this pact was Princess Isabella of Aragon, celebrated throughout Europe for her beauty, intelligence, and learning. Her grace was the subject of countless tales told in noble courts, from Madrid to Vienna. Rodrigo's engagement to Isabella was sealed, and it was Alfonso himself who brought the news to his son. "This marriage is not just for you, my son. It is for Spain." Rodrigo laughed lightly. "So, does Spain also want a beautiful wife?" Alfonso chuckled. "Perhaps it does." From their first meeting, Rodrigo and Isabella discovered an unexpected and genuine connection. She loved books and poetry, and though Rodrigo had been hardened by years of military service, he too harbored a deep affection for literature and the quieter arts. They would spend hours strolling in the palace gardens beneath the cypress trees, or sitting by the fountains exchanging verses and philosophies. Queen Elena watched these encounters with a quiet satisfaction. In her eyes, this match promised not only joy for Rodrigo, but also a stronger, more stable realm. But fate had other plans. A few months later, the court was shaken by a proclamation no one had foreseen. King Alfonso II himself would marry Isabella. The announcement struck like a bolt of lightning, and none felt it scorch more than Rodrigo. He was seated among the courtiers when the words left the king's lips. The blood drained from his face. He said nothing, but his hands clenched into fists, knuckles white against his lap. The days that followed were heavy with a strange, unspoken tension. Isabella was now queen, and for Rodrigo, she had become a forbidden memory. Their meetings in court were formal, their words carefully measured. Yet, in their eyes lingered the ghosts of conversations never finished, of laughter cut short, of futures quietly buried beneath the weight of the crown. Queen Elena urged him more than once, "Forget her. Holding on will only break you." But bitterness had already rooted itself deep in Rodrigo's heart, and in time, it hardened into something darker. September 1573. Madrid. The air in the royal court was thick with unease. Ambassadors drifted in and out of the great hall, their hushed voices weaving threads of intrigue through the day. Outwardly, the Spanish Empire stood strong. Yet, in the far northern territories, especially the Netherlands, rebellion simmered dangerously. In a meeting of his closest advisors, Alfonso II unfurled a vast map across the table. His finger landed on the northern coast of the Netherlands. "Here," he said, voice firm, "the rebel faction known as the Watergeuzen openly defies our rule. We must bring them under control." Rodrigo, newly returned from a military campaign, leaned forward. "Father, brute force will not win here. Give them greater autonomy, lower the taxes, and they will choose loyalty themselves." A tense silence fell. The king's advisors glanced between father and son, sensing the invisible fault line running between them. Alfonso's voice came like the edge of a blade. "My son, concessions are a sign of weakness. Give one province its freedom today, and tomorrow the whole empire will crumble." Rodrigo held his tongue, but inwardly he was certain. His father's iron-fisted approach was the real danger. A few weeks later, Rodrigo took a step that would quietly set disaster in motion. One night, long after the palace had fallen into silence, he received a small group of Dutch envoys in his private chambers. The room was lit only by a single oil lamp, its flame throwing restless shadows across the walls. The air smelled of wax and secrecy. Rodrigo spoke without the cautious dance of courtly speech. "I believe your independence is necessary. If the day comes when I wear the crown, you will have greater autonomy and lower taxes." One envoy leaned forward, voice low and wary. "And if you never take the throne?" Rodrigo's lips curled into a sly grin. "Then perhaps you will still have a friend in me." It might have ended there, a dangerous whisper that never escaped the stone walls. But the palace was full of ears, and not all were friendly. Among Rodrigo's rivals, none was more dangerous than Don Hector, the cunning minister of finance. For years he had stayed close to Alfonso, his influence woven into every decision. Now he saw his opening. The report he carried to the king was not only the truth, it was sharpened with lies. One evening, Alfonso sat in his study, bent over a desk piled high with parchment, when a knock came. "Your Majesty, I bring grave news," Hector said from behind the door. Without looking up, Alfonso replied, "If it's another treasury audit, come back tomorrow." "No, sire, this is about your son." Alfonso straightened, eyes narrowing. Hector entered and spoke slowly, each word deliberate. He told the king of Rodrigo's meeting with the rebels, of the promises made. Promises that, if fulfilled, could shatter the empire. The truth was already dangerous, but Hector's embellishments turned it into treachery beyond forgiveness. Alfonso's face betrayed nothing, though a storm raged beneath. "Have you told anyone else of this?" "No, sire." only you." The next day, Rodrigo was summoned to his father's private chamber. Beyond the window, the gardens swayed in the late summer breeze, but inside, the air was taut. "I hear you've met with the envoys from the Netherlands," Alfonso began. "Yes," Rodrigo replied without hesitation. "I spoke with them because I believe your hard stance will harm the empire." Alfonso's voice rose. "This is not merely a hard stance. It is strategy. You gave the enemy reason to believe that, as king, you would grant them concessions. That is not diplomacy. It is feeding rebellion." Rodrigo's answer came bitter and sharp. "If winning the hearts of the people is rebellion, father, then perhaps we must rethink what ruling means." The words pierced deep. Alfonso drew a long breath, but in his eyes a decision had already solidified, cold and immovable. For the first time, he saw his son not as an heir, but as a threat. From that day forward, the courtiers' whispers became weapons. Every gesture of Rodrigo's was twisted before it reached the king. His strolls among the people were branded recruitment, his letters labeled secret treaties. Queen Elena pleaded with Alfonso. "What Rodrigo is doing is not treachery. It is compromise." His reply was steel. "Wife, you know your husband, but I know my son, and the empire cannot afford even a moment of weakness." Thus, a single political misstep, and the shadow of suspicion it cast, wound itself into a knot so tight it could never be undone. And so it was that between a father who had once loved fiercely and a son who had once trusted completely, a chasm opened, so deep that only chains could cross it. Madrid, 1573. The chill of autumn whistled through the long corridors of the royal palace, curling around stone pillars and whispering like a restless spirit. Torches lined the walls, their flames flickering weakly, as though even the light itself was uncertain of its place that night. It was to be the night when, inside King Alfonso II's heart, the final battle between father and sovereign would be fought. Prince Rodrigo's political misstep had already shaken the empire's stability, but another wound cut far deeper, one that festered in silence. It was the matter of Princess Isabella, once promised to Rodrigo, now seated on the throne as his stepmother. For Alfonso, marrying Isabella had been a calculated move, a political bond to seal the alliance between Spain and Aragon. But for Rodrigo, it had been the theft of a future. He had known her since childhood, had been bound to her by engagement and certainty. Now, each time he saw her in the halls, wearing the crown meant for a queen, standing beside his father, the betrayal gnawed at him. Rumors crept through the palace like ivy up a wall. Some whispered that the prince sought to reclaim her heart. Others swore he wanted only revenge. Whatever the truth, the whispers multiplied. And so did the tension. One autumn evening, in the quiet of the palace gardens, Queen Elena, Rodrigo's devoted wife, found him pacing beneath the cypress trees. Her voice was steady, but fear laced every word. "Rodrigo, this path will destroy you. Your words, your defiance. The court is beginning to see you as an enemy." Rodrigo's reply was sharp, bitter. "The court sees me as an enemy because I speak the truth. My father calls himself a king, but he forgets he is also a father." In Madrid's shadowed halls, nothing stayed secret for long. Spies, ministers, and political rivals carried Rodrigo's every word straight to the throne. At the center of this web was Don Hector, the calculating minister of finance, whose loyalty was measured in ambition, not devotion. "Your Majesty," Hector said with a bow, "your son is not only in contact with the rebels, He is moving to disgrace your queen. This is not merely the heir to your throne. This is a threat to it." For a long moment, Alfonso sat in silence. His face was stone, but behind it, the first cracks of an impossible choice were forming. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "You know I love my son with all my heart, but if he endangers the empire, then I must do what a king is bound to do." The news struck Queen Elena like a blade. That night, she went to the king's private chambers, her cloak trailing through the dim corridors. She stood before him, her voice trembling but resolute. "Your Majesty, I come to you not as your queen, but as a mother." Alfonso lowered his head for a moment before replying, his tone heavy with something unspoken. "He is my son, Elena. Do you think my heart is made of stone? Then show him mercy," she urged. "You may save the empire with this punishment, but you will destroy your son." The king exhaled slowly, the sound caught between a sigh and a groan. "Sometimes, wife, to save the empire, a son must be sacrificed." The storm outside had reached its peak. Every step Rodrigo took was now painted as rebellion. His secret meetings with envoys from hostile provinces, the whispers of his connection to Queen Isabella, together forming an image too dangerous to ignore. Before Alfonso now lay two paths: forgive his son and risk the empire, or arrest him and show the world that a king values the crown above his own blood. The rain battered the palace roof with relentless force. Alone in his study, Alfonso dismissed his advisors and took up a quill. The letter he wrote was not for a minister nor an enemy, but for Rodrigo. It held only one line: "When we meet tomorrow, I will not be your father. I will be your king." He sealed it with wax, the royal crest catching in the lamplight, and handed it to his servant. "Before sunrise, have the guards ready. No noise. This arrest will be made not with the sword, but with silence." In that moment, the thread between father and son twisted beyond repair. And at dawn, the echo of chains would haunt the palace corridors. October 1573. Madrid Castle. It was that breathless hour between night and dawn, when the sky still lay drowning in an ocean of black, and the only light came from the trembling glow of torches brushing against the cold, wet stone. Rain had fallen without pause through the night, pooling in shallow puddles across the castle courtyard. In each one, the torchlight shivered like broken stars scattered on water. Inside the palace, the silence was thick enough to feel alive, the kind of silence that could shatter eardrums if it ever chose to scream. Only one sound disturbed the stillness: the soft, metallic whisper of chains shifting somewhere in the dark. King Alfonso II stood in his private chamber, not in the gold-embroidered robes of state, nor in silks fit for a monarch, but in the hard, unyielding weight of battle armor. The iron plates pressed against his chest like the burden of the choice he had made. His face held no expression, a stillness carved from stone, as if even his breath had turned cold. 8 guards stood in a half-circle, spears in hand, their points catching the light in deadly glints. Every man there knew this was no ordinary arrest. This was not a traitorous minister or a disloyal servant they were sent for. It was the heir to the throne, the king's own son. The captain of the guard stepped forward, speaking low. "Your Majesty, we await your command." Alfonso's eyes did not waver. "No harm is to come to him, but if he resists, you will not step back." Outside Prince Rodrigo's chambers, Queen Elena stood in the dim gallery, her face pale with sleeplessness and fear. She stepped forward, her voice urgent, trembling. "Alfonso, wait, just one moment." Let me speak to him. He will listen. I swear he will listen." For the briefest heartbeat, Alfonso's gaze met hers. In his eyes, a ghost. The faintest flicker of the love and gentleness that had once bound them. But it vanished as quickly as it had come. "It is too late, Elena," he said, each word heavy as stone. "This decision is no longer mine. It belongs to the Empire." The guards moved into position. One rapped softly on the heavy oak door. "Your Highness, open the door. The king wishes to speak with you." From within came no reply, only the muffled sound of footsteps retreating deeper into the room. Alfonso's hand lifted in silent command. The captain nodded, and a soldier hefted a great iron ram. Thud! The first blow echoed like thunder in the stone corridor. Thud! The second strike shook the hinges. Crash! On the third, the door burst inward in a storm of splinters and dust. In the far corner stood Prince Rodrigo, hair disheveled, eyes dark with sleepless rage. One hand clutched a dagger, the other gripped the back of a wooden chair. "What is this, father?" His voice was low, edged with disbelief. "This is not your father speaking," Alfonso replied, voice quiet but edged with iron. "This is your king, and the king would put his own son in chains? The king will do whatever it takes to save the realm, even if it means sacrificing his son." The guards advanced. Rodrigo raised the dagger, but the metal trembled in his grip. A moment later, his arm dropped, the fight leaving him all at once. In his eyes flickered a sad, mocking resignation, as though to say, "So, you've finally become the man I feared you would be." Cold iron closed around his wrists and ankles. The bite of the chains seared into his skin. Queen Elena tried to step forward, but soldiers barred her path. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Alfonso looked at his son one final time. No words, no tears, only the still, frozen calm of a man who had locked his heart behind stone walls. With a nod, he gave the order. The guards led Rodrigo out into the corridor, the clink of chains growing louder, echoing off the palace walls, a sound that would haunt these halls for years. They gripped him firmly by the arms, guiding him down the spiral of damp, narrow stairs. Each turn stole more light, the air growing colder, heavier. The chains rattled with every step, a hollow, mocking rhythm that followed them like a shadow. Now and then, Rodrigo tilted his head back, chasing the faint light above, as if to memorize daylight's face before it vanished. A smile touched his lips, a strange blend of exhaustion and scorn. "So this," he murmured for the guards to hear, "is the reward for a father's love?" At last they reached the heavy iron door. A warden's key turned in the lock with a grinding reluctance. Hinges wailed as stale air rushed out to meet them. The cell was a stone box, a splintered wooden cot with a threadbare blanket, a clay jug of water, an empty bowl, and a narrow barred window that let in the knife-edge wind from the sea. They shoved Rodrigo inside, removed the chains, and left angry red welts across his skin. The door shut with a sharp, final click, the closing of a chapter. For minutes he stood still, staring at the walls as if waiting for them to speak. Then he began pacing, 4 steps forward, 4 back. Each echo curled around him like a cruel joke. On the cot, his fingers traced the deep scratches left by prisoners before him. He laughed once, without humor. "Then I too shall leave a story. So these stones will know I was here." At first, Rodrigo clung to the hope this was only a temporary punishment. Each morning he paced, sometimes pausing at the slit of a window to breathe in the salt air, storing the scent of freedom. But the cell had laws of its own. laws that break men in days. The damp seeped into his bones, the cold never lifted, and the silence began to hum in his head. By the end of the month, his face had withered, his eyes were sunken, and the glow of youth was gone. His weak legs swelled, wounds refused to heal, and walking the stone floor became torture. Memories no longer comforted him. They stung. His father's smile, the hunt, the bond they once had. Days and nights blurred. He scratched lines on the wall, but lost count. Sometimes he spoke aloud to imagined courtiers, sometimes laughter burst from him, only to be swallowed by tears. The guards began exchanging silent looks. The prince is going mad. Queen Elena had begged to see him countless times. Alfonso had refused, until word came that Rodrigo's health had broken. Man before her was only a shadow of the prince she had known. Cheeks hollow, lips cracked, eyes emptied of life. She reached for his hands. "I've come to take you away," she whispered. Rodrigo's lips curved in a faint, bitter smile. "Take me away." "Where?" "The prison isn't in these walls, Elena. It's inside me." Tears slid down her face. She kissed his forehead. "I will never forget you." "Then don't remember me. Memories are crueler than chains." The guard signaled the visit was over. Elena squeezed his hand one last time and stepped away, knowing in her heart it was the last time she would ever see him. When Alfonso heard of the meeting and the words Rodrigo had spoken, he did nothing, said nothing. He simply sat on his throne in silence, as though the verdict had been set long ago, and all that remained was to carry it out. That night, the prison seemed to hold its breath. Moonlight spilled through the narrow slit of a window, laying silver bars of light across the cold, unyielding stone floor. Rodrigo lay motionless on the cot. Even the simple act of breathing had become a battle, each breath dragging through his chest like the slice of a slow, merciless blade. Beyond the iron door, two guards sat in the dim torchlight, their voices no more than shadows. "Perhaps," one whispered, "it will be over before the dawn." Inside, Rodrigo's lips held the ghost of a smile. Faint, fragile, but touched with something distant. Perhaps it was the memory of sitting high on his father's shoulders as a boy, watching the royal banners ripple in the wind. Or perhaps it was the first time he had seen Elena, her face lit by candlelight. Just before sunrise, a guard dared to peer inside. Rodrigo's body lay still, his eyes half closed, as though he had drifted into some faraway dream. A chill crept through the room, and for a brief, strange moment, it felt as if even the stone walls had paused to listen to his silence. The royal physician arrived. He pressed his fingers to the prince's wrist, waited, and then lowered his head. "The prince is gone," he said quietly. The news reached King Alfonso in the midst of the royal council. Every eye turned toward the throne. The king spoke only one line, his voice as steady as iron. "Prince Rodrigo has departed this world by the will of God." No tremor in the voice, no flicker of grief, only the unbending dignity of a sovereign. To the court and to the people, the message was clear. The king had placed the empire above his own blood and still stood unshaken. But that night, when the palace corridors lay empty, Alfonso sat alone in his private chamber. He opened a small leather box. Inside, a simple wooden horse, carved years ago by his own hands for a laughing boy who had once called him father. The moment his fingers closed around it, the walls he had built within himself cracked. In the shadowed corner of the room, away from every eye, the king wept, silent, unrestrained tears for a son he could never have back. By morning, the steel mask of rule returned. and the court saw only the monarch, not the grieving man. For Queen Elena, the news was like a room stripped of light, a chamber where dawn would never come. She wore the black of mourning as tradition required, but the true grief was etched in her eyes, in the silent tremor of her hands. By day, she sat in the palace gardens, holding one of Rodrigo's old rings in her palm, her gaze sometimes lifting toward the sky, as if the wind might carry her a reply. In the official records, Rodrigo's name faded to a footnote. But in the streets, he lived on. In the marketplace, ballads began to drift from the lips of wandering singers. The prince who could break iron, but not his father's decision. The one who fell asleep within the castle walls, but remained awake in the people's hearts. The song reached the palace gates, but no one silenced it. Rodrigo was gone from the empire, yet, as a story, he had already escaped time. Years passed. Laughter of a new heir rang through the halls, yet in Elena's heart remained a locked room that no passing year could empty. One day, unseen, she walked to the forgotten wing of the fortress, to the place that had been his prison. The door was rusted, the key old and heavy in her hand, borrowed from the palace's aging treasurer. When the lock turned, a breath of stale, cold air spilled into the hallway. Inside, the walls bore the scars of time. Dust veiled the floor, and silence pressed close. Elena stepped inside, her fingers brushing the space where his cot had once stood. She closed her eyes, and for a heartbeat, he was there again. The same smile, the same voice, the same presence. "I still hear you," she whispered. Then she turned, closing the door behind her, walking away without looking back. The room sank into darkness once more, but in its silence, the echo of his story, the story of a son, a king, and the empire that came between them, continued to breathe, unending.